Section 6 of Great Pirate Stories. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Great Pirate Stories by Various. Edited by Joseph Louis French. Section 6. Barbarossa, King of the Corsairs. Barbarossa, King of the Corsairs, from Sea Wolves of the Mediterranean, by E. Hamilton Curry, R.N. At the coming of spring, Barbarossa was at sea again with 32 ships, ready for any eventuality, his crews aflame with ardour for revenge against those by whom they had been so roughly handled. He chose for the scene of operations a place on the coast of Majorca, some 15 miles from Palma. From here he commanded the route of the Spaniards from their country to the African coast, and it was against this nation that he felt a great bitterness owing to recent events. Eagerly did the Corsair and his men watch for the Spanish ships, the heavier vessels lying at anchor, but the light, swift galleys ranging and questing afar so that none might be missed. Very soon the vigilance of the Moslems was rewarded by the capture of a number of vessels sent by Bernard de Mendoza, laden with Turkish and Moorish slaves, destined to be utilized as rowers in the Spanish galleys. These men were hailed as a welcome reinforcement, and joyfully joined the forces of Hayreddin when he moved on Minorca, captured the castle by a surprise assault, raided the surrounding country, and captured 5,700 Christians, amongst whom were 800 men who had been wounded in the attack on Tunis. All these unfortunates were sent to refill the bagnio of Algiers. This private war of revenge was, however, destined soon to come to an end. Suleiman the Magnificent in this year became involved in disputes with the Venetian Republic, and recalled that veritable man of the sea, as Barbarossa had been described by Ibrahim, to Constantinople. In this city by the sea there had taken place a tragedy, which, although it only involved the death of a single man, was nevertheless far-reaching in its consequences. For the man was none other than that great statesman Ibrahim, Grand Vizier, and the only trusted counsellor of the Padishah. He who had been originally a slave had risen step by step in the favour of his master, until he arrived at the giddy eminence which he occupied at the time of his death. It is a somewhat curious commentary on the essentially democratic status of an autocracy that a man could thus rise to a position second only to that of the autocrat himself, and in all probability wielding quite as much power. Ibrahim had for years been treated by Suleiman more as a brother than as a dependent, which in spite of his Grand Viziership he was in fact. They lived in the very closest communion, taking their meals together and even sleeping in the same room. Suleiman, a man of high intelligence himself, and a ruler who kept in touch with all the happenings which arose in his immense dominions, desiring always to have at hand the man whom he loved, from whom, with his amazing grip of political problems and endless fertility of resource, he was certain of sympathy and sound advice. But in an Oriental despotism there are other forces at work besides those of la haute politique, and Ibrahim had one deadly enemy who was sworn to compass his destruction. The Sultana Roxolana was the light of the harem of the Grand Turk. This supremely beautiful woman, originally a Russian slave, was the object of the most passionate devotion on the part of Suleiman, but she was as ambitious as she was lovely, and brooked no rival in the affections of Suleiman, be that person man, woman, or child. In her hands the master of millions, the despot whose nod was death, became a submissive slave. The undisciplined passions of this headstrong woman swept aside from her path all those whom she suspected of sharing her influence, in no matter how remote a fashion. At her dictation had Suleiman caused to be murdered his son Mustafa, a youth of the brightest promise, because in his intelligence and his winning ways he threatened to eclipse Selim, the son of Roxolana herself. This woman possessed a strong natural intelligence, albeit she was totally uneducated. She saw and knew that Ibrahim was all-powerful with her lover, and this roused her jealousy to fever heat. She was not possessed of a cool judgment, which would have told her that Ibrahim was a statesman dealing with the external affairs of the Sublime Porte, and that with her and with her affairs he neither desired nor had he the power to interfere. What, however, the Sultana did know was that in these same affairs of state her opinion was dust in the balance when weighed against that of the Grand Vizier. Suleiman had that true attribute of supreme greatness, the unerring aptitude for the choice of the right man. He had picked out Ibrahim from among his immense entourage, and never once had he regretted his choice. As time went on and the intellect and power of the man became more and more revealed to his master, that sovereign left in his hands even such matters as despots are apt to guard most jealously. We have seen how, in spite of the murmurings of the whole of his capital and the almost insubordinate attitude of his navy, he had persevered in the appointment of Hayreddin Barbarossa, because the judgment of Ibrahim was in favor of its being carried out. This, to Roxalana, was gall and wormwood. Well she knew that, as long as the Grand Vizier lived, her sovereignty was at best but a divided one. There was a point at which her blandishment stopped short. This was when she found that her opinion did not coincide with that of the minister. She was, as we have seen in the instance of her son, not a woman to stick at trifles, and she decided that Ibrahim must die. There could be no hole and corner business about this. He must die, and when his murder had been accomplished, she would boldly avow to her lover what she had done, and take the consequences, believing in her power over him to come scatheless out of the adventure. In those days, when human life was so cheap, she might have asked for the death of almost anyone, and her whim would have been gratified by a lover who had not hesitated to put to death his own son at her dictation. But with Ibrahim it was another matter. He was the familiar of the Sultan, his alter ego, in fact. It says much for the nerve of the Sultana that she dared so greatly on this memorable and lamentable occasion. On March the 5th, 1536, Ibrahim went to the royal seraglio, and following his ancient custom, was admitted to the table of his master, sleeping after the meal at his side. At least so it was supposed, but none knew, save those engaged in the murder, what passed on that fatal night. The next day his dead body lay in the house of the Sultan. Across the floor of jasper, in that palace which was a fitting residence for one rightly known as the Magnificent, the blood of Ibrahim flowed to the feet of Roxalana. The disordered clothing, the terrible expression of the face of the dead man, the gaping wounds which he had received, bore witness that there had taken place a grim struggle before that iron frame and splendid intellect had been levelled with the dust. This much leaked out afterwards, as such things will leak out, and then the Sultana took Suleiman into her chamber and gazed up into his eyes. The man was stunned by the immensity of the calamity which had befallen him and his kingdom, but his manhood availed him not against the wiles of this Circe. Ibrahim had been foully done to death in his own palace, and this woman clinging so lovingly round his neck now was the murderess. The heart's blood of his best friend was coagulating on the threshold of his own apartment when he forgave her by whom his murder had been accomplished. This was the vengeance of Roxalana, and who shall say that it was not complete? The Ottoman Empire was the poorer by the loss of its greatest man. The jealousy of the Sultana was assuaged. The despot who had permitted this unavenged murder was still on the throne, thrall to the woman who had first murdered his son and then his friend and minister. But the deed carried with it the evil consequences which were only too likely to occur when so capable a head of the state was removed at so critical a time. Renewed strife was in the air, and endless squabbles between Venice and the Porte were taking place. With these we have no concern, but in addition to other complaints, there were loud and continuous ones concerning the Corsairs. Venice, the bride of the sea, had neither rest nor peace. The pirates swarmed in Corfu, in Zante, in Candia, in Cephalonia, and the plunder and murder of the subjects of the Republic was the theme of the perpetual representations to the Sultan. The balance of advantage in this guerrilla warfare was with the Corsairs until Girolamo Canale, a Venetian captain, seized one of the Moslem leaders known as the young Moor of Alexandria. The victory of Canale was somewhat an important one, as he captured the galley of the young Moor and 4 others. 2 more were sunk, and 300 Janissaries and 1,000 slaves fell into the hands of the Venetian commander. there being an absence